in the darkness between worlds, sealed away from the plane that rejected him. Yawgmoth waited. Not in silence, for silence suggests peace, but in the screaming chorus of machinery and transformation. In the twisted geometries of an artificial plane where metal learned to breathe and flesh learned to obey. This is the story of what he built there, of the 9 spheres he shaped into his image, of the paradise that became a hell, of perfection pursued until it consumed everything that made life worth living. The Thran had sealed him away, thinking distance would protect them. They could not have known that isolation would only give him time. Time to perfect his vision, time to build an empire of oil and agony, time to create beings that would one day carry his gospel of completion to every corner of the multiverse. This is Phyrexia, the machine hell, the 9 spheres. And for 5,000 years, it was Yawgmoth's alone. Before we descend into what it became, we must first understand what it was. Before Yawgmoth's touch corrupted every surface and shadow. Before the oil seeped into its foundations and the screams of transformation echoed through its depths. The plane that would become Phyrexia was old even before it earned its name. An artificial world, built by a planeswalker whose identity has been lost to time. We know only fragments about this creator, that they were humanoid in origin but preferred to take the form of a dragon, that they possessed knowledge of plane crafting that few have ever matched, and that they died there, alone, their body decaying in the deepest sphere of their creation. When the planeswalker Dyft first brought Yawgmoth to this nameless plane, it was not yet the nightmare it would become. The first sphere, the surface, was almost beautiful in its strangeness. Artificial forests spread beneath a simulated sun, their trees made of metal, but covered in something like moss, something that grew and changed and responded to the seasons programmed into the plane's structure. Serpentine creatures coiled around metallic trunks, their bodies an amalgam of organic tissue and crude mechanical components. Strange birds wheeled through the sky, their wings catching light in ways that suggested both feather and bronze. The meat of these creatures was edible, Dyft had noted. Strange and metallic in flavor, perhaps, but nourishing. They were not truly alive in the way life flourishes on natural planes, but they were not entirely dead either. They existed in a space between, animated by the plane's own energies, part of an ecosystem that ran on principles different from biological worlds, but functional nonetheless. The second sphere, revealed when one descended through carefully hidden passages in the first, glowed with its own metallic luminescence. Here, more sophisticated artifact creatures moved through chambers of polished surfaces and geometric patterns. The amalgamation was more pronounced here, mechanical systems integrated with something approximating flesh in ways that suggested the plane's creator had been experimenting, testing the boundaries between the organic and the constructed. Lower spheres existed, but had never been fully completed. The Dragon Planeswalker had died before finishing the grand design, whatever it had been. Rooms lay empty, their purposes unknown. Corridors led nowhere. And in the deepest sphere, in what would one day be called the 9th, the creator's corpse still lay, slowly decaying in a place where time moved strangely, surrounded by tools and blueprints for projects that would never be realized. It was, in its way, a gentle place. Alien, certainly. Unsettling in its marriage of life and mechanism. But not evil. Not yet. It was simply incomplete. A grand experiment abandoned halfway, waiting for someone to give it purpose. Yawgmoth gave it purpose. When Dyft offered him this plane as a refuge, as a space where he could build his paradise away from the Thran's judgment, he saw not what it was, but what it could become. The metal forests of the first sphere would make excellent grounds for testing new life forms. The luminous chambers of the second could house workshops and laboratories. The empty lower spheres could be assigned functions, organized according to a hierarchy that would reflect the perfection he envisioned. And the name. The plane needed a name worthy of its destiny. He called it Phyrexia, after Phyrex, a small town where he had been born on Dominaria, a place that no longer existed, consumed by time and the Thran Empire's expansion. In naming the plane after his birthplace, Yawgmoth was making a statement about his intentions. This would be his new home, his new empire, the place where he would build what the Thran had been too cowardly to accept. The first Thran refugees came through Dyfed's portal suffering from phthisis, the disease caused by Power Stone radiation. Yawgmoth had promised them healing, had promised that away from Dominaria's Power Stones they would recover, and in a sense they did. The disease's progress halted in Phyrexia's environment. They stopped getting worse, but Yawgmoth did not stop there. Rebek, the architect who had once been his ally, had designed a simple infirmary for these refugees, a clean, functional space where they could rest and recover. Yawgmoth let her build it, let her believe they were creating a sanctuary. But even as she laid foundations and planned rooms, he was planning something else entirely. The refugees were weak, yes, diseased, yes, but also malleable. Their bodies already compromised by the phthisis, already showing the crystalline changes that the disease induced. They were perfect subjects for the next phase of his work. He began with surgical interventions, replacing diseased tissue with mechanical components as he had done before in Halcyon. But here, without the Thran Council watching his every move, without Rebek or Glacian questioning his methods, he could go further. He didn't just replace what was damaged, he improved, enhanced, optimized. A patient whose lungs had been scarred by phthisis received new lungs, mechanical bellows that processed air with perfect efficiency, that would never tire, never fail. But in the process, Yawgmoth also installed regulatory systems that connected to the patient's nervous system, that allowed him to monitor their breathing, to adjust it remotely if needed. Control disguised as healing. Another patient, whose legs had weakened from long illness, received new limbs. Stronger, faster, more durable than flesh had ever been. But the new legs came with modifications to the spine, to the hips, changes that made the patient more stable but also more dependent on regular maintenance that only Yawgmoth's priests could provide. One by one, the refugees were improved, perfected, completed. They retained their memories, their personalities. Yawgmoth needed them functional and intelligent, not mindless drones. But with each surgery, with each modification, they became a little less human and a little more something else. A little more beholden to the systems he had installed in their bodies. A little more aligned with his vision of what humanity should become. This was Phyrexia. Not merely a medical process, but a philosophy. The transformation of weakness into strength, the replacement of fallible flesh with reliable mechanism, the evolution of humanity into something superior, and it was only the beginning. Rebek's infirmary expanded, though not in the way she had intended. More refugees arrived from Dominaria, and each one was brought into Yawgmoth's program of improvement. The building grew, sprawling outward in the alien landscape of the first sphere. Over centuries, for Yawgmoth and his followers would remain in Phyrexia for a very long time indeed, that infirmary would become Yawgmoth, the first true city of Phyrexia. A metropolis of modified beings, all loyal to the healer who had saved them, all dependent on the systems he had created. But Yawgmoth's ambitions extended far beyond a single city on a single sphere. He had an entire plane to remake. 9 spheres to organize according to function, a hierarchy to establish, a civilization to build from the raw materials of suffering and transformation. Let us descend now, layer by layer, through the spheres of Phyrexia. Let us see what Yawgmoth built in his 5,000 years of exile. Let us understand the machine hell that would one day threaten all of Dominaria. The first sphere, the surface, the face that Phyrexia shows to those few visitors who might somehow find their way here through the sealed portals. What had been a strange but almost peaceful forest became something else under Yawgmoth's influence. The metallic trees remained, but now they wept oil instead of dew. The creatures that moved through the undergrowth were no longer simple amalgams of flesh and metal, but purpose-built predators, designed to test new arrivals, to cull the weak, to ensure that only those worthy of completion could survive even this first level. The sky turned red, not the red of sunset or sunrise, those gentle transitions between light and dark that mark natural worlds, but a deep, angry crimson, sunless and unchanging. Clouds, heavy with metallic particles, drifted through that red expanse, casting strange shadows, occasionally raining oily precipitation that hissed when it struck the ground. Enormous furnaces rose from the landscape, their tops vanishing into the red haze above. These furnaces served multiple purposes. They processed raw materials brought up from lower spheres. They provided power for the plane's systems. They filled the air with smoke and ash, creating an atmosphere that was barely breathable, but that Yawgmoth had calculated would force adaptation, would encourage his subjects to accept respiratory modifications rather than suffer the constant irritation of unfiltered air. The ground itself became a mixture of metallic dust and oily soil, neither fully one thing nor the other. Walking across this surface left black footprints that never quite faded. Streams that had once flowed with that strange but drinkable liquid were now slicks of thick oil, undrinkable without processing, hostile to anything that tried to drink from them unmodified. And scattered throughout this transformed landscape, the testing grounds. Open areas where newly arrived newts, the Phyrexian term for those not yet fully completed, were released to prove themselves. Predators patrolled these areas. Dragon engines, the first and most impressive of Yawgmoth's war machines, mechanical beasts in the shape of dragons but far larger, far more deadly. Their bodies combined organic tissue with metal frameworks, powered by systems that ran on oil and steam and something else, something that might have been magic or might have been the plane's own strange energies. The newts who survived the testing grounds earned the right to descend to the fourth sphere for proper completion. Those who failed provided raw materials for future projects. Nothing was wasted in Phyrexia. Not flesh, not metal, not even failure itself. Gamalgoth sprawled across one section of the first sphere, the infirmary-turned-city that had started everything. By the time 5,000 years had passed, it had grown into a proper metropolis, though its architecture was nothing like the soaring towers of Halcyon or the careful designs of Rebek's original vision. Gamalgoth grew organically, in the sense that tumors grow organically. Buildings merged with each other, connected by tubes and conduits. Streets were rarely level, often sloping at angles that suggested the city itself was tilting, sinking slowly into the sphere's surface. Here lived those Phyrexians who had been deemed ready for independent function, but not yet worthy of deeper access. They performed maintenance, monitored systems, processed newcomers. And always, they continued their own modifications, pursuing the perfection that Yawgmoth promised. But that always seemed just out of reach, just one more surgery away. The second sphere, the layer of ruins and refuse. When one descended from the first sphere through passages hidden in the landscape, through tunnels that twisted and curved in ways that ordinary geometry couldn't quite explain, one emerged into the second. And the first thing any visitor would notice was the ceiling. Where the first sphere had its red sky, however artificial, the second sphere was capped by a roof of twisted metal beams, massive pipes, and structural elements that seemed to serve no clear purpose except to remind anyone looking up that they were indeed underground now, enclosed, trapped between layers. The ceiling was not uniform. In some places it hung low, forcing travelers to duck or crawl. In other areas it soared upward into shadow, lost in the gloom. Light in the second sphere came primarily from smokestacks that pierced up through the floor from even deeper levels. These great chimneys belched fire and smoke continuously, their light flickering and unreliable, casting harsh shadows that jumped and danced with each surge of flame. The air carried a sharp, acidic taste that burned the throat and stung the eyes, or would have had most of the inhabitants still possessed vulnerable flesh. Those who worked here had long ago accepted modifications that made them immune to such discomforts. The ground was composed of debris from the first sphere above. Broken machinery, fragments of failed experiments, the remains of dragon engines that had outlived their usefulness. Everything that was discarded from above eventually settled here, creating a landscape of metal shards and rusted components. Walking across it was treacherous. Sharp edges lurked beneath seemingly solid surfaces. Holes opened unexpectedly, leading down to the third sphere or to nowhere at all, to gaps between floors where things fell and were never recovered. But the second sphere was more than just a garbage heap. It also housed massive ammunition dumps, warehouses larger than city blocks, filled with the weapons and equipment needed for Yawgmoth's eventual war against Dominaria. Spore canisters that could infect entire populations. Plague flasks containing diseases Yawgmoth had designed specifically to counter Dominarian immune systems. Weapons designed to kill efficiently, to maim strategically, to corrupt thoroughly. These dumps were guarded, of course. Not because Yawgmoth feared theft, who would steal from the god of their own plane, but because certain weapons were dangerous even to Phyrexians, required careful handling, needed to be kept separate from other compounds lest unfortunate reactions occur. The guards were among the most modified of all Phyrexians, beings who had sacrificed almost all their organic tissue in exchange for strength and durability, sufficient to survive even if the weapons they guarded were somehow released. The second sphere was also where many Phyrexians lived when they were between assignments, when they were not actively working on some project or mission. Housing here was rough, utilitarian. Small chambers carved into piles of debris, barely large enough to lie down in. The Phyrexians didn't need comfort. That was a weakness of flesh, something to be overcome. But they did need rest periods, times when their bodies could perform maintenance on their own systems without conscious oversight. So they returned here, to the second sphere, to sleep among the ruins of what they had once been. The third sphere. The labyrinth of pipes and horror. Descending further, the nature of Phyrexia changed again. The third sphere was not a place of buildings or even of ground in any conventional sense. It was a maze, a three-dimensional puzzle constructed from pipes of every diameter, from tubes thin as a finger to conduits large enough to walk through comfortably. These pipes carried everything Phyrexia needed to function: oil, steam, power, data, sometimes even Phyrexians themselves, traveling through the network like blood cells through arteries. The pipes created strange effects on space itself. Distances became unreliable. A corridor that appeared to stretch for miles might actually loop back on itself after only a few dozen feet. Passages that seemed to run parallel would somehow cross each other at impossible angles. And strangest of all, the third sphere prevented planeswalking to lower spheres. The spatial distortions were too severe, too chaotic. Any planeswalker who tried to bypass the third sphere and directly access the fourth or lower would find themselves shunted back to the third. Or worse, trapped in the spaces between, caught in the impossible geometries where the pipes intersected in ways that mathematics could not describe. This was by design. Yawgmoth had learned from his time with the Thran, had understood that planeswalkers represented a particular threat, beings who could bypass normal defenses, who could appear anywhere they wished. The third sphere was his answer to that threat, a defensive layer, a ward against teleportation. Anyone who wanted to reach the lower spheres would have to pass through here, would have to navigate the labyrinth, would have to face what lived in the pipes. And what lived there were horrors. The term is used loosely in many contexts, but in Phyrexia it was a classification. Horrors were beings that had been modified beyond any recognizable form, that existed primarily to kill, that had been given just enough intelligence to hunt but not enough to question. They lurked in the larger pipes, waiting for vibrations that suggested prey. They moved through the network with predatory grace, their bodies adapted perfectly to the environment. Limbs that could grip smooth metal surfaces, sensory organs that could detect the heat of living tissue or the electromagnetic signatures of active machinery. Some of these horrors had names that would one day be whispered in fear on other planes. The Rager, a thing of muscle and fury that could tear through metal as easily as flesh. The Plague Spitter, which carried Yawgmoth's diseases in sacs throughout its body and could infect entire areas simply by passing through. The Devouring Strauss, massive beyond belief, able to consume anything it encountered and convert it into more of itself. The Gargantua, lumbering but unstoppable. The Negator, which existed in a state of constant mutation, its form never quite stable, impossible to predict or counter effectively. Not all horrors lived in the third sphere. Some were deployed to other areas, some were kept in reserve in deeper spheres, but the third was where most of them made their home, where they waited for orders or prey with equal patience. The laborers who maintained the pipe network had to move carefully here, had to announce their presence constantly, broadcasting identification codes that told the horrors they were permitted. They were Phyrexian. They were not food. Even so, accidents happened. A malfunctioning transmitter, a horror too newly created to recognize proper signals. A simple mistake in navigation that led someone into a horror's territory. The third sphere consumed workers regularly, but Phyrexia had workers to spare. The cost was acceptable. The system functioned. The fourth sphere, the heart of Phyrexia, the sphere where most Phyrexians lived and worked, where the bulk of the plane's population existed, where the future of the species was literally grown. Descending past the nightmare maze of the third, one emerged into a sphere that was almost industrial in its organization, almost comprehensible. Here were smokestacks again, their tops extending up through the ceiling into the third sphere, their bases anchored in great furnaces that provided power and heat. Here were workshops and factories, assembly lines where dragon engines and other war machines were constructed piece by piece. Here were barracks for warrior Phyrexians, training grounds where they honed their skills, armories where they received their weapons. But the fourth sphere's true importance lay in the Fane of Flesh. The Fane was a massive structure, a building that took up more space than any city on Dominaria, a complex of interconnected chambers that all served one fundamental purpose, the creation of new Phyrexians. Here, in vast vats of bubbling, glistening oil, newts were grown, not born, not hatched, grown. The process Yawgmoth had developed over centuries was elegantly efficient. Glistening oil, a substance that was partly biological, partly mechanical, partly something else entirely, served as the base medium. When properly cultured, when the right nutrients and energies were added, when the correct patterns were imposed upon it, the oil would begin to organize, would form cells that were similar to, but not quite identical to, living cells, would build tissues that approximated organs, would create something that looked like a humanoid form, but that was already, from the moment of its first awareness, more machine than animal. Each newt was predestined. Before it even opened its eyes, its purpose had been decided. Warrior, priest, laborer, engineer, scholar. Phyrexian society had roles that needed filling, and newts were created to fill those roles. Their bodies were grown with the appropriate modifications already in place. Warriors with enhanced musculature and reinforced skeletons. Priests with neural augmentations that allowed them to process vast amounts of data. Laborers with redundant systems that let them work in conditions that would kill unmodified beings. The Vat priests oversaw this process. These were Phyrexians who had shown particular aptitude for biological and mechanical integration, who understood how to coax the oil into forming specific patterns, who could adjust the growing process to produce the exact type of being Yawgmoth's plans required. They moved among the vats with practiced efficiency, monitoring, adjusting, sometimes terminating growths that showed deviation from the planned parameters. Each newt, when grown to the point of viability, was removed from its vat and given basic education. Not extensive, that would come later after completion. but enough to function, enough to understand commands, enough to begin its journey toward perfection. And each newt had a heart. Not a physical heart, though most had those too. A heart stone. A small black power stone similar to those the Thran had used but corrupted, changed, made compatible with Phyrexian systems. This heartstone was magically and mechanically linked to the newt, would remain bound to it throughout its life. The stones served multiple purposes. They powered some of the newt's augmentations. They allowed the priest to monitor the newt's location and condition. And most importantly, they could be used to control the newt if necessary, to shut down its systems remotely if it showed signs of rebellion or malfunction. The heartstones were kept in deep vaults within the fane, thousands upon thousands of them, each one corresponding to a living Phyrexian, heavily guarded, carefully monitored, a repository of power and control that ensured Yawgmoth's authority over his creations. From the fane, newts were sent to other areas of the fourth sphere for the next phase of their development, completion. This was the final transformation, the process that would take them from functional but imperfect newts to fully realized Phyrexians. It involved more surgeries, more modifications, more replacements of organic tissue with mechanical components. The exact nature of the completion varied depending on the newt's designated role, but the goal was always the same. Remove weakness, add strength, eliminate inefficiency, achieve perfection. Not all newts survived completion. The process was harsh, pushed bodies to their limits. Perhaps 1 in 3 survived to emerge as a complete Phyrexian. The rest provided raw materials for future batches, their bodies rendered down into components that would be mixed back into the vats. Even failure served the greater purpose. The fourth sphere also housed Phyrexia's planar portals. These were reinvented versions of the Thran's planar portal technology, adapted and improved by Yawgmoth's engineers. The original portals had required massive energy inputs or the sacrifice of vast resources. Yawgmoth's versions could be opened more easily, though they still demanded payment. Artifacts thrown into the portal's maw, or creatures sacrificed at its threshold, their life energy converted into the power needed to tear a hole between planes. Through these portals, Phyrexia could reach out to other worlds, could send scouts, could establish outposts, could eventually launch invasions. But during the 5,000 years of Yawgmoth's isolation, the portals remained mostly dormant. The seal on the main portal to Dominaria held firm, and without access to that plane, there was little point in expending resources on expeditions to other worlds. Yawgmoth was patient. He would wait. And while he waited, he would continue building his army. The fourth sphere's sky was perpetually overcast with clouds and lightning. Unlike the first sphere's red emptiness, here, atmospheric effects were dramatic, almost theatrical. Lightning arced between smokestacks. Thunder rolled through the workshops. And sometimes, when the lightning flashed, one could glimpse the pipes of the third sphere above. A reminder that even here, in Phyrexia's most populated sphere, the labyrinth loomed overhead, watching, waiting. A fine mist of glistening oil rained down constantly from the pipes above, coating everything in a thin sheen. The Phyrexians barely noticed it anymore. It was simply part of the environment, part of what it meant to exist in this place, but that constant rain served a purpose. It kept the oil circulating through the entire plane. It ensured that every surface, every creature, every breath of air carried traces of the substance that was, in many ways, Phyrexia's lifeblood. The fifth sphere, the boiling sea. Below the industrial bustle of the fourth, the nature of Phyrexia changed once more. The fifth sphere was not a place of workshops or vats or training grounds. It was a single, enormous ocean. A sea of glistening oil that bubbled and churned and steamed, heated by the furnaces of the deeper spheres, agitated by massive mechanisms that had kept it in constant motion. This was where the oil came from. Not all of it, some was synthesized in the fourth sphere's vats. Some was brought in from raids on other planes. But the bulk of Phyrexia's glistening oil supply originated here in the boiling sea. The oil was, in its way, alive, semi-sentient, able to reproduce itself when given the right conditions. It grew in the fifth sphere's depths, multiplying, spreading, an endless supply of the medium that made Phyrexian life possible. The vat priests of the fourth sphere drew their oil from the fifth, sending down pipelines that extended deep into the sea. They pulled up the bubbling substance and transported it to where it was needed. But the fifth sphere was more than just a reservoir. It was also home. Massive steam creatures lived in the boiling sea. Beings that were more vapor than flesh, more pressure than substance. They moved through the oil like whales through ocean water, their passage creating waves and whirlpools, their presence detectable more by the changes they caused in the sea's temperature and movement than by direct observation. Were they intelligent? Perhaps. Yawgmoth had never bothered to determine. They served their purpose by existing, by keeping the oil agitated, by preventing stagnation. That was enough. The walls of the fifth sphere were partially organic, partially mechanical. Metal pylons extended from ceiling to floor, providing structure, but between them grew strange formations that might have been coral, might have been fungus, might have been something entirely new that had evolved in the oil. These formations served as anchors, as filters, as places where the oil could accumulate certain compounds or release others. They were tended by specialized Phyrexians who could survive the hostile environment of the fifth sphere, being so heavily modified that they could breathe the oil-saturated air, could withstand the heat, could navigate the sea's treacherous currents. Few others descended to the fifth sphere. It was necessary, yes, critical to Phyrexia's function, but not a place where ordinary Phyrexians could work or live. It was too hot, too unstable, too fundamentally alien even by Phyrexian standards. Those who maintained the fifth sphere were specialists, so modified for their environment that they could no longer function elsewhere. They lived their entire lives in the boiling heat and oil-thick air, and when they died, their bodies were simply absorbed into the sea, becoming part of the substance they had spent their lives tending. The sixth sphere, the seat of power, the domain of the inner circle. Passing through the heat and pressure of the fifth, descending through corridors that were designed to humble and intimidate anyone traveling them, one emerged into the sixth sphere. And the change was immediate and striking. Where the spheres above were functional, industrial, designed for work and production, the sixth sphere was designed for power, for authority, for the display of Yawgmoth's chosen elite. The landscape here was almost beautiful, in a terrible way. Fields of barbed wire stretched across the ground like metallic grass, each strand carefully placed, each barb precisely angled. The wire wasn't there to prevent movement. One could walk across it without difficulty if one were properly modified. It was there as art, as demonstration. Look what we can do with something as simple as wire. Look at the patterns we can create from pain. The sky of the sixth sphere was solid white, not clouded, not bright, just white, featureless, unchanging. An emptiness above that suggested the absence of limits, of boundaries, of anything that might constrain the beings who ruled here. And the beings who ruled here were the inner circle. These were Yawgmoth's most trusted servants, his demons. Not true demons in the sense that other planes understood the term, but beings who had been transformed so thoroughly that they bore little resemblance to their original forms, who wielded powers that seemed demonic in their scope and destructiveness. His praetors, Phyrexians, granted the power of life and death over all who ranked below them in the hierarchy, who commanded armies and oversaw operations and answered only to Yawgmoth himself. The greatest of these was Gix. Gix had been there from the beginning, had been among the first Thran refugees to accept Yawgmoth's modifications, had proven himself over and over through centuries of loyal service. Where other Phyrexians might retain some vestige of their original humanity, some memory of what they had been before completion, Gix had embraced transformation completely. His body was a construct of bone, mechanical parts, and soft tissue arranged in configurations that suggested but did not replicate humanoid form. He was powerful enough to fight planeswalkers, loyal enough that Yawgmoth trusted him with the most sensitive missions, and ambitious enough that he always sought ways to prove himself further, to rise even higher in his master's favor. Gix and his fellow members of the Inner Circle resided in the Sixth Sphere, in chambers that were part palace, part fortress, part laboratory. Here they planned Phyrexia's operations. Here they received reports from agents on other planes, though during the 5,000 years of isolation, such agents were few and far between. Here they debated strategy and philosophy, discussed the nature of perfection, refined their understanding of what Yawgmoth's vision truly meant. The Sixth Sphere also housed the pneumagogues, strange insectile creatures with 6 wings and red shells that existed in a state between physical and spiritual. On the upper spheres, they were purely corporeal, could be touched and killed like any other creature. On the lower spheres, they were purely ethereal, spirits that could not be harmed by physical means. But here, in the Sixth, they were both, simultaneously flesh and spirit, able to shift between states at will. The pneumagogues were beautiful in their own way. Their shells gleamed. Their wings created harmonious sounds when they flew. Their movements were graceful, almost hypnotic. They would one day play a role in corrupting Urza himself, when the great planeswalker descended to Phyrexia and was shown wonders that made him question everything he thought he knew. But during the 5,000 years of isolation, they served primarily as decoration, as demonstrations of Yawgmoth's mastery over the boundary between life and death, body and soul. The Inner Circle met regularly in great chambers carved from the Sixth Sphere's foundations. Here, they discussed progress on various projects, the development of new warrior classes, the refinement of plague delivery systems, the optimization of dragon engine designs, the expansion of the Fane's capacity. Every aspect of Phyrexia's development was overseen by the Inner Circle, and every decision ultimately served Yawgmoth's goal of eventual return to Dominaria. But the Inner Circle were not mindless servants. They had their own agendas, their own interpretations of what perfection meant, their own ambitions and rivalries. Gix believed in aggressive expansion, in conquest and domination. Other praetors advocated for more subtle approaches, infiltration, subversion, the slow corruption of other planes from within. These debates were encouraged by Yawgmoth. He wanted his servants to think, to innovate, to develop new strategies. A hierarchy of automatons would be efficient but brittle. A hierarchy of thinking beings, all aligned toward the same ultimate goal, but approaching it from different angles, would be stronger. As long as they all ultimately served him, their disagreements were productive. And if any of them ever forgot who truly ruled Phyrexia, well, the Seventh Sphere was always ready to remind them. The Seventh Sphere, the Punishment Sphere, the closest thing to hell that Magic's multiverse had ever known. This was where failures were sent, where those who displeased Yawgmoth were brought for correction, where the price of imperfection was paid in endless agony. The Seventh Sphere was an eternal furnace. Flames filled vast chambers, fire that burned hot enough to melt metal that reduced organic tissue to ash in seconds. But the heat served dual purposes. Yes, it punished, but it also powered the plane above, fed energy into the systems that kept the upper spheres functioning. The screams of the tortured were incidental. What mattered was the power generated by their suffering. Spatial distortions affected the Seventh Sphere much as they did the Third, but in different ways. Here, distance from the ground to the ceiling varied unpredictably. Enormous grinders hung in the sky, their teeth studded with diamonds, gnashing against each other with a sound that could be heard throughout the sphere. Sometimes these grinders were impossibly far away, visible but unthreatening. Sometimes they descended without warning, crushing and grinding anything beneath them, before rising back into the heights. The inhabitants of the seventh sphere were primarily prisoners and Phyrexian gremlins. The prisoners were those who had failed in their assignments, who had shown weakness or doubt, who had in some way disappointed Yawgmoth. They were brought here to be reformed through suffering, to be taught through pain what they had failed to learn through instruction. Some were eventually released, sent back to the fourth sphere to resume their duties, their lessons learned. Others remained in the seventh sphere forever, their bodies endlessly rebuilt and repaired so that their suffering could continue, their existence a warning to others about the price of failure. The gremlins were smaller creatures, bat-eared and dark-furred, related to Ufis found on other planes but modified for Phyrexian service. They served as torturers and maintenance workers, taking joy in destroying artifacts and tormenting artificers and pulling apart anything complex and watching it fail. They were not intelligent in the way Phyrexians were, but they served their purpose, and they thrived in the heat and chaos of the seventh sphere in ways that more sophisticated beings could not. Only one being was known to have survived the seventh sphere and returned to prominence. Gix. Early in Phyrexia's development, he had made a mistake. The details are lost to history, but the punishment was not. Yawgmoth had sent him to the seventh sphere, had subjected him to its torments, had left him there for what might have been years or decades or centuries. Time moved strangely in the seventh sphere, and those who endured it rarely spoke of the experience afterward. When Gix finally emerged, he was changed. More thoroughly loyal, more perfectly aligned with Yawgmoth's will, more willing to do whatever was necessary to avoid ever returning to that place. His survival became legendary among Phyrexians, proof that even the seventh sphere's torments could be endured, that nothing was beyond redemption if one was strong enough, dedicated enough, perfect enough. But for most, the seventh sphere was a place to fear above all others. Better to die than to be sent there. Better to risk anything than to face the flames. The eighth sphere, a mystery even to most Phyrexians. Little is known of the eighth sphere. Those who have descended to it rarely speak of the experience, and most Phyrexians never descend that far at all. It is described as a place of pure energy. No solid surfaces, no breathable atmosphere in any conventional sense, just energy in its rawest form, flowing and pulsing and existing in ways that biological or mechanical minds struggle to comprehend. Some speculate that the eighth sphere serves as Phyrexia's primary power source, that the furnaces of the seventh are only secondary, that the true engine that keeps the plane functioning lies here in this sphere of pure force. Others suggest it is a barrier, a final defense before the ninth sphere, designed to prevent unauthorized access to Yawgmoth's sanctum. Still others believe it is experimental, a space where Yawgmoth tests theories about the nature of reality itself, where he pushes the boundaries of what is possible even in an artificial plane. What is certain is that the eighth sphere exists, that it serves some purpose in Phyrexia's design, and that Yawgmoth occasionally descends through it, passing through the energy without apparent difficulty, moving between the seventh and ninth spheres as if the eighth were nothing more than a doorway. For anyone else, attempting to traverse the eighth sphere would likely be fatal. The energy there is too concentrated, too intense, too alien. It would overwhelm organic nervous systems, overload mechanical circuits, destroy any vessel not specifically designed to withstand its effects. The eighth sphere is inviolate, a perfect seal between the domain of the inner circle and the domain of Yawgmoth himself. The ninth sphere, the sanctum, the nerve center of Phyrexia, the throne room of the god of machines. At the very core of the plane, beyond all the other spheres protected by layers of defense and distance, lay the ninth sphere. And here, Yawgmoth resided. The ninth sphere was unique among all of Phyrexia's levels. Where the others had consistent properties, consistent rules, the ninth operated according to Yawgmoth's will alone. Reality there was malleable, responsive to his thoughts. He could shape it into anything he desired. could create environments to test his theories or entertain his curiosity, could construct elaborate scenarios to manipulate those few beings he allowed into his presence. Sometimes, the ninth sphere appeared as a vast throne room, with Yawgmoth seated upon a chair of fused metal and bone, his form towering and terrible. Sometimes it was a laboratory where he conducted experiments that would have been too dangerous to perform in the upper spheres. Sometimes it was simply empty space, a void where Yawgmoth existed as consciousness without body, pure will unencumbered by physical form. For Yawgmoth had changed during his time in Phyrexia. The human physician who had arrived here with Dyfed was gone, consumed by the transformations he had inflicted upon himself. He had fused with the plane itself, had become one with its systems, had achieved a state of being that transcended both organic and mechanical existence. He was everywhere in Phyrexia and nowhere, could manifest physically if he chose, taking whatever form suited his purposes, could remain purely as distributed consciousness, observing and directing from the ninth sphere, while his will extended through every level of the plane. He had become what he had always dreamed of becoming: perfect, beyond weakness, beyond death, beyond the limitations that had constrained him as a Thran physician. And yet, perfection brought its own frustrations. He was bound to Phyrexia now, fused with it in ways that meant he could not leave without abandoning much of his power. He had traded freedom for godhood, and while the trade seemed worthwhile, it also meant that his revenge on Dominaria would have to be enacted through intermediaries, through armies and plagues and subtle corruptions, rather than through his direct intervention, unless he could find a way to manifest on Dominaria itself, to bring his power through the sealed portal, to descend upon his former home as a god of death and transformation. That became his obsession during the 5,000 years of isolation. Not just building an army, though that continued apace, not just refining his philosophy, though he spent countless hours contemplating the nature of perfection, but finding the method, the mechanism, the technique that would allow him to personally return to Dominaria and complete the work he had started. In the ninth sphere, he experimented with consciousness transfer, with the projection of his will across planar boundaries, with the corruption of reality itself. He studied the seal that held the portal closed, analyzed its structure, looked for weaknesses. He developed contingency plans upon contingency plans, strategies that accounted for every possible response the Thran's descendants might mount against him. And he waited, patiently, inexorably, with the confidence of one who had all the time in the world and knew, with absolute certainty, that eventually his moment would come. The portal would open, the seal would break, and when it did, Phyrexia would be ready. 5,000 years is a long time, even for a god. But Yawgmoth filled those years productively. When he wasn't experimenting or planning, he observed his creations, watched them grow and change, took satisfaction in seeing his vision made real across the 9 spheres. Phyrexia had become a civilization in its own right. Not the paradise he had promised the first refugees. That had been a lie from the beginning. But something arguably more impressive. A society perfectly organized according to function. Every Phyrexian knew their role. Every system operated at peak efficiency. There was no waste, no conflict, no doubt. Only purpose and its pursuit. The hierarchy was clear and absolute. At the bottom were the newts, newly grown, not yet completed, proving themselves worthy of transformation. Above them were the laborers, those completed Phyrexians assigned to maintenance, manufacturing, or other basic tasks. Above the laborers were the warriors, trained for combat, enhanced for destruction. Above the warriors were the priests, scholars, and engineers, those who maintained Phyrexia's more complex systems, who developed new techniques, who interpreted Yawgmoth's will for the masses. Above all these were the knights, elite warriors who retained more autonomy than standard soldiers, who could think strategically, who led armies and conducted complex operations. The knights were organized into orders, The Eastern Paladins dedicated to eradicating all natural life, the Western Paladins focused on destroying societies that opposed Phyrexian philosophy, and the Order of Yawgmoth, the personal guard of the ineffable, the most honored position a Phyrexian could achieve. Above even the knights were the demons and praetors of the inner circle. And above them all, alone in the ninth sphere, was Yawgmoth. It was a hierarchy built on the principles he had developed over his lifetime: survival of the fittest, controlled evolution, the elimination of weakness, the embrace of transformation. Every Phyrexian accepted this hierarchy because they had been built to accept it, because their heartstones ensured compliance, because they literally could not conceive of an alternative. This was how existence worked. This was what life meant. To question it would be to question reality itself. Phyrexian religion, for it was a religion though its adherents would not have called it such, centered on worship of perfection and reverence for Yawgmoth as the father of machines. They believed that mortal flesh was sin, imperfect and prone to weakness and decay. They held that machines properly designed and maintained were sacred, but only those machines made by Yawgmoth or under his direction. Artifacts made by mortals' natural hands were abominations, unfit for Phyrexia, not born for their cause. And the artificers who made such things were even more despised, mockeries of the father of machines creating sacrilegious imitations of his holy work. The great evolution was their gospel, the search for evolutionary superiority, for improvement, for the perfect fusion of purpose and form. Phyrexia was their sacrament, the process by which weakness was purged and strength was installed. Every surgery, every modification, every transformation brought them closer to the ideal. And the ideal was Yawgmoth himself, who had transcended all limitations, who had become pure will made manifest. It was, in its way, a complete worldview, self-consistent, internally logical, and utterly inescapable for those who lived within it. The Phyrexians could not rebel because rebellion was not a concept their modified minds could properly formulate. They could not doubt because doubt had been surgically removed along with their appendixes and their capacity for independent thought. They were perfect servants of a perfect master, building a perfect civilization that would one day spread across the multiverse. And when it did spread, when the portal finally opened and Phyrexia's armies flooded into Dominaria, they would bring not just conquest, but conversion. Every being they encountered would be offered the same gift Yawgmoth had offered the first Thran refugees: transformation, improvement, perfection. Those who accepted would be welcomed into Phyrexian society, would be given roles appropriate to their capabilities, would ascend the hierarchy as their enhancements warranted. Those who refused would be destroyed. Not out of cruelty, the Phyrexians were not cruel, any more than a machine is cruel when it performs its function, but out of necessity. Organic life was weak, diseased, imperfect. It had to be replaced with something better. If beings refused improvement, they were essentially refusing existence itself. Their elimination was not murder, but mercy, saving them from the suffering inherent in unmodified flesh. This was the philosophy that filled every corner of Phyrexia, that echoed through the 9 spheres from the first to the 9th, that drove every action and every plan: perfection through transformation, strength through sacrifice, eternity through the elimination of flesh. As the centuries passed, Phyrexia prepared. The fane of flesh expanded, growing new chambers, increasing capacity, producing more newts with each generation. The vat priests developed new techniques, learned to create more specialized Phyrexians for more specific purposes. The warriors trained in elaborate simulations, war games that tested their tactical abilities and their willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. The engineers designed new weapons, new delivery systems for plagues, new ways to corrupt and subvert. And through it all, Yawgmoth watched, guided, corrected when necessary, praised when appropriate. He had all the time he needed to perfect his creations, to ensure that when the moment came, Phyrexia would be unstoppable. The dragon engines evolved over the centuries. The first generation had been crude, powerful but slow, effective but inefficient. Later generations were faster, more intelligent, better integrated. By the time 5,000 years had passed, Phyrexia's dragon engines were sophisticated war machines, capable of independent operation but loyal beyond question, able to fly at speeds that natural dragons could never match, armed with weapons that could level cities or precisely eliminate single targets as needed. The Plague Development Program produced thousands of different strains, each designed for specific circumstances. Airborne diseases that could spread through populations before anyone realized they were infected. Waterborne diseases that could contaminate entire regions. Touch-transmitted diseases that spread only through direct contact, allowing for more controlled infection patterns, and diseases that specifically targeted the genetic markers of certain Dominarian bloodlines, allowing for surgical strikes against enemy leadership. Every possible contingency was planned for. Every potential defense was analyzed and countered. Every weakness in Dominaria's society, and there were many. 5,000 years was a long time. Civilizations changed, forgot, grew complacent, was identified and targeted. And slowly, very slowly, microscopic flaws began to appear in the seal that held the portal closed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that anyone on Dominaria would notice. But Yawgmoth noticed. In the ninth sphere, merged with the plane itself, he could sense the seal's structure, could feel the tiny fluctuations that suggested it was not eternal after all, that it was degrading, wearing away atom by atom across millennia. Eventually, it would fail. The portal would open, and on that day, Phyrexia would be ready. Until then, Yawgmoth made himself patient, made his creations wait, kept the armies in reserve and the plagues in storage and the dragon engines dormant. Phyrexia would have its day. The great evolution would spread beyond its 9 spheres. The multiverse would be perfected. All it required was time. And time, for a god bound to an immortal plane, was infinite. So the spheres turned. The oil boiled. The forges burned. The vats grew new generations of Phyrexians. The inner circle planned and debated. The warriors trained and waited. And in the 9th sphere, Yawgmoth dreamed of Dominaria's conquest and the revenge that had been delayed but never forgotten. 5,000 years of preparation. 5,000 years of evolution and refinement. 5,000 years of building an army and a philosophy that would threaten all of existence. And then, finally, the moment Yawgmoth had been waiting for arrived. 2 brothers, exploring ancient ruins in the caves of Koilos, found a power stone. A very special power stone, one that glowed with unusual intensity, one that seemed to call to them both. In their excitement, in their eagerness to claim the prize, they both grabbed it simultaneously, and the power stone, which had been holding the portal sealed for 5,000 years, split in 2. Each brother took half, neither understanding what they had just done, what they had just released. In Phyrexia, in the 9th sphere, Yawgmoth felt the seal break, felt the portal begin to open, and smiled a smile that no human mouth could have formed, that existed only as a configuration of will and power. The wait was over. He summoned Gix, his most loyal servant, his first demon, the one who had proven himself worthy time and time again. He gave him his orders. Scout Dominaria, assess its current state, find the 2 who had opened the portal, manipulate them, use them, turn their conflict into something that would weaken Dominaria's defenses and pave the way for Phyrexia's eventual invasion. Gix accepted the mission with something like joy. Finally, after 5,000 years, he would see the world his ancestors had come from, would walk on natural ground under a natural sky, would begin the great work that Phyrexia had been preparing for across centuries. The demon stepped through the portal, emerging in the caves of Koilos, and immediately set about his task. He found the brothers, Urza and Mishra, already feuding over their shared discovery. Perfect. Their rivalry could be exploited, intensified, turned into war that would consume Dominaria's resources and make it vulnerable. And back in Phyrexia, in the 9 spheres that had been shaped into a hell of perfection, the armies began to mobilize. Slowly, carefully, without urgency. There was no rush. The portal was open. Dominaria was accessible. Everything was proceeding according to plan. 5,000 years of waiting. But the wait was over. Phyrexia's time had come. The spheres that Yawgmoth had built, each one a monument to transformation and power, each one a piece of his grand design, would soon serve their ultimate purpose. The army he had grown in the fane of flesh would march. The plagues he had developed in his laboratories would be released. The dragon engines he had refined over centuries would take flight. And at the center of it all, in the 9th sphere, Yawgmoth himself prepared for his eventual return to the plane that had exiled him. He had promised them perfection. They had refused. Now he would give it to them anyway, whether they wanted it or not. And this is what Yawgmoth built in his isolation. This is what the Thran's exile created. 9 spheres of horror and perfection, inhabited by beings who had sacrificed their humanity for strength, who had traded free will for purpose, who existed only to serve their God and spread his gospel. The machine hell was complete, and Dominaria, sleeping and unaware, had no idea what was coming. From the 1st sphere to the 9th, from the oil-slick forests to the sanctum where reality itself bent to Yawgmoth's will, Phyrexia stood ready. 5,000 years of evolution had created something unprecedented, something terrible, something perfect. The brothers' war would be only the beginning. Gix's manipulations would set Urza and Mishra against each other, would create conflict that spanned decades and reshaped continents. But that war was just Phyrexia's opening move, a test of Dominaria's defenses, a chance to gauge what kind of resistance could be mounted. The true invasion would come later, when the time was right, when Phyrexia had learned enough about its enemy, when Yawgmoth had perfected his plan for personal manifestation on Dominaria itself. Until then, the spheres would continue their work. The fane would continue growing warriors. The priests would continue refining techniques. The inner circle would continue planning. And Yawgmoth, in his sanctum at the heart of it all, would continue waiting, watching, preparing. For he had learned patience in his 5,000 years of exile, had learned that perfection could not be rushed, had learned that revenge, served cold enough, was all the sweeter. The 9 spheres of Phyrexia, each one a layer of hell, each one a step toward the ultimate goal, each one a testament to what happens when brilliance becomes obsession, when healing becomes horror, when a man decides he knows better than nature how life should be. This is what the Thran created when they exiled Yawgmoth. This is the cost of their refusal to accept his vision. This is the price that would be paid in the wars to come. And the cycle would continue. Even after Yawgmoth's eventual defeat, even after the 9 Titans' assault would damage the spheres, even after Urza's legacy weapon would finally destroy the god of machines himself, the philosophy would survive, the glistening oil would survive, and on a plane called Mirrodin, created by a golem named Karn, who carried traces of that oil in his very being, it would all begin again. But that is a story for another time. For now, we leave Phyrexia as it was during those long centuries of waiting. 9 spheres of perfection. 9 layers of transformation, 9 levels of a hell built not by demons, but by a man who believed he was creating paradise. Remember this as you drift towards sleep. Remember that the greatest horrors are often born from the best intentions, that perfection pursued without wisdom becomes monstrosity, that the line between healing and harm can disappear entirely when crossed too many times. The 9 spheres of Phyrexia stand as a warning, as a monument, as a reminder that progress without ethics, advancement without compassion, transformation without consent creates not a better world, but a worse one. creates not paradise, but hell. And somewhere, in the spaces between planes and the mathematics that define the multiverse itself, echoes of those 9 spheres still linger. Still wait. Still hunger for the completion that was promised but never quite achieved. Sleep well, and be grateful you do not dream of Phyrexia. If this journey into darkness has intrigued you, if the terrible beauty of Yawgmoth's creation has captured your imagination, there are more tales waiting. The Brothers' War, where Phyrexia's influence first touched Dominaria again. Urza's long campaign of revenge and the 9 Titans' assault. The cycle of rebirth on Mirrodin, and so much more. Subscribe, and let these stories carry you into the night. The multiverse is vast, and its histories run deep. And I'll be here, ready to explore them with you, one nightmare at a time. Until we meet again, may your dreams be free from glistening oil.